a little late. Actually, a case just came up, and in fact, I asked the patient to come back later now because I was suspecting an acute labyrinthitis in that case.
Okay, sir. So you want some time, sir?
No, no, I have sent the patient back, so I think I can start sharing my screen.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So
Yeah,
let me just introduce
yeah.
the session, sir. So Dr. Harshita will start.
Good evening, everyone. Today is our 11th webinar on how to attend DNB OSCE station. Agenda of the webinar would be to discuss evaluation of the patient for vertigo by Dr. Avinash Bijlani sir. Then basic concepts of a vestibular ocular reflex, head impulse test, and various positional diagnostic tests and maneuver by Dr. Srinivas Dorasala sir. And the last is hearing rehabilitation by Dr. Surya Prakash sir. So I welcome all the eminent speakers and thank you for guiding us. First speaker would be Dr. Avinash Bijlani sir. He is a senior ENT consultant and neuro-otologist from New Delhi. He was the past president of IMA Karol Bagh branch in New Delhi. Did his MBBS from MS Ramaiah Medical College, Bangalore, ENT from SM Medical College, Jodhpur. He is a very renowned speaker in the field of neuro-otology and balance disorder. He has given numerous talks, lectures on vestibular disorders. Currently, he is working as senior visiting consultant, Delhi Heart and Lung Institute, New Delhi, and Madhav ENT and Vertigo Clinic in New Delhi. Without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Bijlani sir. Sir, over to you.
So, friends, when it comes to dealing with the patient of vertigo, uh, clinical history takes precedence over literally everything else that you might have on mind. And the ultimate goal for us, whenever we get any patient, irrespective of whether vertigo or anything else, is to arrive at a reasonable diagnosis. And one has to remember that there is never ever a role for a spot diagnosis in vertigo. We are all ENT specialists, ENT surgeons, and in a busy OPD, when we see a patient, we look at a perforation in the eardrum. It's a spot diagnosis. Tonsillitis, nasal polyposis, they are all spot diagnosis. But please remember that there is absolutely no scope for a spot diagnosis in a patient of vertigo. So the way one can reach the goal of arriving at a proper diagnosis in a case of vertigo is basically by taking a good patient history, which relates to the type of vertigo the patient is suffering from, the duration of the vertiginous event, and also the frequency of the vertigo attacks, if at all the patient is having recurrent episodes of vertigo, and the trigger factors which might be giving rise to vertigo. And that is followed by a good clinical examination. So the patient's history is at best pretty vague. He may come and say he's tilting, he's feeling dizzy, rocking, spinning, feeling lightheaded, off balance, or whatsoever. It is up to us as to how we can find out of this jargon of words the patient has to say, what exactly is the actual diagnosis. So for that, we have to give time to the patient. We have to allow the patient to talk, listen to what all he has to say, and from that jargon, we have to decipher as to whatever is required for us to arrive at the diagnosis. So the aims of a good clinical history are, as I said, to reach a diagnosis. And if you're not arrived at a diagnosis in more than in a patient, in more than 90% of cases, by a good clinical history, the diagnosis may never be found. And the other is to clearly delineate the type and extent of disability that has been caused to the patient. The same disorder can cause different extents of disability in different patients. For example, a patient of vestibular neuritis, one patient might be feeling mildly nauseous and he will be having a rotatory form of vertigo, and another might be having a copious vomiting. That's one example for you as to the extent of disability the patient is suffering. Now, also to determine the effect of the medication that the patient has taken prior to coming to us, and whether the patient has been maladapting or adapting. An example of maladaptation is, say, a patient of BPPV always keeping his neck stiff to avoid the vertigo. So that is maladaptation. And when we talk of vertigo, vertigo is just a symptom. And the disorders could be from any area. Now, what are the areas where the disorders could be from? You could have it from the peripheral vestibular organs. You could have it from abnormal central transmission of the sensory input, or there could be an impaired integration at the cortical level. Now, why does clinical history really become important? Patients come, as I said, with vague complaints. Becomes very crucial in the emergency room. You have a patient with an acute attack of vertigo, and you have to literally differentiate whether this vertigo is due to a peripheral system disorder, or the patient is undergoing a stroke. And another issue is, some patients with, or rather most of the patients with recurrent episodic vertigo, they present to us usually during the asymptomatic period when they are not having the attack. And here the diagnosis depends totally, absolutely on the history that the patient may give you, because when you try to examine the patient, there may be no telltale sign of anything. So I'll quickly go through the classification of dizziness, which was according to Drachman. Vertigo, that is a rotatory sensation, that is an illusory sensation of movement in space. Could be due to vestibular or central causes, but more often is due to vestibular causes. Then it's disequilibrium, which would be explained as a sense of imbalance or unsteadiness. Could be from vestibular, could be a somatosensory disorder, could be due to the visual problems, or it could be again central. Presyncope is a sense of impending loss of consciousness, and this is due to impaired cerebral blood flow, or could be due to hypoglycemia also. Lightheadedness. Here the patient complains of a floating sensation, sensation of swimming, or a sensation of rocking, and this particular subcategory, the attacks are triggered by stress. Now I'll quickly list the salient features that we have to look for in the history.
Sir,
One is type of dizziness, then the duration of the dizziness.
Bijlani,
How
sir.
long the attacks last.
Sir, can you go little slow, sir?
Okay. The degree of disability, and whether there's a history of falls or not, and whether the patient's condition is improving over time, or it is deteriorating, or it is stabilized. Then we have to ask for drug history. We need to search for trigger factors. We'll go through all these one by one. I'm just trying to categorize the things right now. And we have to also ask for any associated symptoms and other diseases which the patient may be suffering from. Now, type of dizziness. See, now here I'm going to try and tell you exactly what could be your probable diagnosis depending upon the primary type of dizziness that the patient complains of. Now, if it's that of a rotatory sensation, like as if he is going in a merry-go-round, that suggests more likely a labyrinthine cause, and a typical prototype is acute vestibular neuritis. Postural imbalance, like as if the patient is traveling in a boat. Here you should suspect bilateral vestibulopathy. Patient complains of lightheadedness and has vague, non-specific symptoms. Should think in terms of a phobic postural vertigo or any psychogenic form of dizziness. See, most of us have felt presyncopal dizziness at some time when rapidly we have tried to stand up from the sitting position, or we are trying to get up from a supine position. And the best example in this category of lightheadedness is this, a presyncopal attack. Then you have other causes like orthostatic hypotension, cardiac arrhythmias, hyperventilation syndrome, panic attacks, hypoglycemic attacks, drug intoxication. So these are all non-vestibular causes which present as lightheadedness. Now coming to attacks of rotatory vertigo, that is episodic vertigo. The disorders that come in this category are vestibular migraine, Meniere's. You should ask about a history of drop attacks, whether the patient has had sudden unprecedented falls. Then the other things that come in this category are vertebrobasilar transient ischemic attacks, vestibular paroxysmia, very rare, Verellum fistula, BPPV, and Cogan syndrome. As far as I think uh, residents are concerned, for your examination point of view, you have to remember three things: vestibular migraine, Meniere's disease, and BPPV in episodic vertigo. Vestibular paroxysmia and rest of the things are on the rarer side. Now, sustained rotatory vertigo. Now, this is either due to an acute peripheral loss of vestibular function, the prototype of which is acute vestibular unilateral neuritis, or then it could be due to pontomedullary brainstem lesions in the area of the vestibular nuclei. So I'll just enlist the peripheral and central causes of sustained rotatory vertigo. Vestibular neuritis tops the list. If it is associated with hearing loss as well, then one has to think in terms of a labyrinthitis. Then autoimmune inner ear diseases on the rarer side again, acoustic neuroma, labyrinthine infarction, and labyrinthine concussion. These are all peripheral causes. Central causes include multiple sclerosis, brainstem infarctions, and tumors. Now coming to positional vertigo. The most common cause of positional vertigo is BPPV. The rest are all rarer causes. Only thing is that one has to differentiate BPPV from the more difficult situations like central vestibular disorders, where you have positional downbeat nystagmus, central positional nystagmus, central paroxysmal positional vertigo, and central positioning vomiting. So basically, to make it simpler, one has to basically differentiate between BPPV and central causes. Dr. Srinivas will be talking about BPPV and maneuvers also. That's why I'm skipping the details of BPPV in the history, and I'll also skip it in the physical examination. Otherwise, there'll be a lot of repetition. Then oscillopsia. Either a patient of bilateral vestibulopathy or a poorly compensated case of acute unilateral vestibular neuritis when you see him at a later stage. These are the patients who will complain of oscillopsia. And this is how it looks. And oscillopsia is basically, it's an apparent motion of the visual scene. The patient is unable to read or recognize faces while walking, has to keep his head still to be able to look at things clearly. And this gets worse in the dark or when the patient is walking on uneven ground. So this video will tell you exactly what the patient is going through. As if the patient is walking, holding a camera in front of his eyes, and everything is shaking. So now the duration of vertigo is also very important in the history part and gives us a very good idea as to the presumptive diagnosis. So if the duration is from seconds to minutes, you have to think in terms of BPPV, and a rarer cause is vestibular paroxysmia. Duration of many minutes to hours. Think of Meniere's disease, vestibular migraine, or transient ischemic attacks. Persistent vertigo lasting for days to weeks. Here you have vestibular neuritis or a labyrinthitis amongst the peripheral causes. Postural imbalance that lasts for years together. The first thing that comes to mind is phobic vertigo, or it's a there's a central cause, or you are dealing with a case of bilateral vestibulopathy. If you like, you can take a screenshot of this particular slide. This gives you a quick idea as to, depending upon the duration, what could be your probable diagnosis. So I'll wait for the next 10 seconds. Anybody who wants to take a screenshot of this is welcome. I'll proceed now. Now the last category I'm going to talk about is persistent or recurrent vertigo, which has been present for a very long time. That is, it is a chronic form of vertigo or dizziness. So things that come under the chronic persistent dizziness, that is, it's present all the time. The patient usually, the symptoms are related to the body posture, and it's more severe when the patient is walking or standing, and it's reduced on sitting and almost absent in the recumbent position. The first thing that you should think in terms of is a psychiatric dizziness, then of course bilateral vestibulopathy, psychological aging, and the terminology now given to physiological aging is presbyvestibulopathy. Presbyvestibulopathy. Then there are other neurological disorders, and it could be drug induced. The patient is chronically on a certain drug which could be causing it. Then recurrent attacks of vertigo having been present over a very long time. Think of vestibular migraine, Meniere's disease, again vertebrobacillar TIAs, vestibular paroxysmia, perilimb fistula, and BPPV. Now one must ask about the degree of disability the patient has. Patients with peripheral vertigo are usually able to stand and walk by themselves without support. While those with central vertigo, they almost always need support to stand and walk. Ipsiversive falls, that is, the patient falls to the side of the lesion, is seen in vestibular neuritis, in Wallenberg syndrome, that's a lateral medullary infarction situation, and then in BPPV also. Controversive falls, that is, the patient falls to the side opposite to that of the lesion. This is seen in autolytic Tullio phenomena and in vestibular epilepsy. So you're asking about the difficulty, the extent of disability. So one of the questions that you must ask is it difficult to walk in the dark? By now, I think you must be having an answer to this. Patients who have oscillopsia, they find it difficult to walk in darkness. And the first thing that you should think of in this situation is a bilateral vestibulopathy. Ask the patient, are you afraid to look left and right in a jiffy to cross the road? Again, the same diagnosis comes to mind. Does your dizziness increase in crowded places? Now, these are the cases in which you have to think in terms of phobic vertigo, psychogenic background, fear of heights, and that again gives you a clue to a psychogenic background. Now, how has the problem progressed? Peripheral disorders, by and large, they tend to improve over time because there's a very good compensatory mechanism which takes weeks to months depending upon patient to patient. It's variable, but most of the time patients with peripheral disorders will improve over time. But at least even if they don't improve, they don't progress to a worsening situation. Central lesions are mostly permanent and they may progress to deteriorate over time depending upon the etiopathogenesis. Now to ask about the drug history also. Now this is a list of drugs that you should keep in mind: aminoglycosides, diuretics, antidepressants, sedatives, muscle relaxants, anti-allergics. Alcohol has a very strong role. Excessive intake of alcohol leads to vertigo the next morning. Labyrinthine sedatives, of course, we know, and also if the patient is on any other anti-vertiginous drugs. You must remember that many of the anti-vertigo drugs that we have available in the market, most of them don't cause a selective sedation of the labyrinth. They cause a generalized sedation, and that can definitely lead to dizziness. And there are many people having these medicines, buying them over the counter, and they have been consuming them, like as if it's food. And these are the patients you have to decipher. You have to find out if you are dealing with such a patient, and you have to stop the medication in these patients in these situations. So now coming to trigger factors, whether the problem is present at rest. the possible diagnosis that come to mind, the first thing that comes to mind is acute vestibular neuritis, downbeat nystagmus syndrome, then you have vestibular migraine and Meniere's disease. While walking, bilateral vestibulopathy. Turning the head from side to side, again bilateral vestibulopathy, and vestibular paroxysmia attacks are triggered by head motion. Changing the head position relative to gravity, VPPV. Is it triggered by coughing, pressing the tragus, or as a result of loud sounds? Think in terms of a third window, like a perilymph fistula or a superior semicircular canal dehiscence syndrome. Then context dependent intensity. Does it worsen in certain situations? Is it worse in overcrowded places? Is it worse in supermarkets? Is it worse on going to the 10th floor of a building? So think in terms of phobic postural vertigo. Then we should ask for other associated symptoms also related to the peripheral vestibular system and related to central neurological symptoms. Now, vestibular nuclei, the reticular formation and the midline vestibulocerebellar structures, they integrate mainly vestibular and autonomic activities. So you should ask whether there's a change in salivation, there's a history of vomiting, is there increased gastric motility, any endocrine responses, does the patient feel coldness or numbness, is he sweating, is there pallor? Then auditory dysfunction is also very important. You should ask about the history of hearing loss. How long has the hearing loss been present? Which is the site affected? Whether it was a gradually increasing hearing loss, or is it a sudden hearing loss, or if there is any fluctuation in the hearing loss. Fluctuation in hearing loss is seen in Meniere's disease. Then you should ask for history of tinnitus. Should ask for history of feeling of pressure in the ear. Both these also, we are talking in terms of Meniere's basically. There are of course other things, but primarily from the examination point of view, hearing loss, fullness in the ear, tinnitus, these are the triad of symptoms seen in Meniere's disease. If there's a history of ear discharge, history of trauma, ear surgery, post-ear surgery also you can have vertigo. One of the surgeries that gives rise to vertigo post-surgery is Stepey's surgery. Peripheral vestibular disorders, again I've already told you, Meniere's, perilymph fistula, CP angle, temporal bone tumors, and vestibular paroxysmia, ear trauma. Central causes are pretty rare, but then hearing loss may occur alongside vestibular epilepsy and in multiple sclerosis. Should ask for history of headaches, because basically you have to think in terms of vestibular migraine, which is again one rather the most common episodic form of vertigo found today. I'll not go into details, but the history of photophobia, phonophobia, and again trigger factors like lack of sleep, stress, during the menstrual cycle in females. These are a few of the things which act as trigger factors in vestibular migraine. I think we'll skip this. And then now coming to what are the precipitating factors possible. So things that give us an idea that the patient might be suffering from an ischemic central lesion, that is old age, a history of smoking, history of hypertension, history of diabetes mellitus, and a history of thromboembolic disorders will give us an idea as to whether the patient is suffering from something other than peripheral vestibular disorders. Cardiomyopathy could be there, valvular heart disease, atrial fibrillation could be there. So to summarize, if the duration, the patient gives you a history of recurrent attacks, and if on the other hand, there's a history of unsteadiness rather than rotatory vertigo, and here the vertigo is persistent, then trigger factors present or absent, then accompanying symptoms like hearing loss, tinnitus, present or absent, then whether the patient has ataxia, diplopia or not, then it gives you a fairly decent idea whether you are dealing with a peripheral disorder or a central disorder. Now I'll just summarize the common disorders that you could think of based on history. So of course, vertigo is present in all the situations. You're dealing with one single event of acute vertigo that has been present for hours at least, or could be present for days together, and the hearing loss is present. Then your possible diagnosis is labyrinthitis. Now, same situation, but there's a lateralized headache and related to aura, and there's a monthly frequency. You think in terms of vestibular migraine. Think in terms of BPPV when the duration is only of few seconds or to maximum of a minute or two, and the attacks are positionally provoked. And if the patient is from a middle age group or older age group, then you think in terms of BPPV. Vestibular neuritis, no hearing loss. There is no hearing loss in vestibular neuritis, must remember that. And one event with acute duration lasting for days together. Then you have recurrent events with duration of minutes to hours. And there is a fluctuating hearing loss, tinnitus, and oral fullness. Think in terms of Meniere's disease. Constantly present symptoms, patient says he has instability or postural imbalance that gets worse on walking, worse in the dark. Think in terms of bilateral vestibulopathy. Now to sum it up all, consider the life of a patient condemned to live with an unresolved permanent dizziness. The most important cause for this situation is that the doctor has not spent enough time with the patient and he has not taken a thorough history, and that's why the patient has been deprived of a proper diagnosis. And last but not the least, please do not hesitate to ask leading questions when dealing with the patient of vertigo or dizziness. Thank you. So I'll move over to the next talk. So after history, the next thing that is most important to us is a good physical examination also. This I'm going to skip because Dr. Srinivas is going to talk to you about VOR. So now basically when we are doing a physical examination of a patient, we have to, our aim is to arrive at a good topographical diagnosis, because these are the structures that are involved: the vestibular labyrinth, the two eyes, the proprioceptors. They are giving information to the brainstem and also interacting. The vestibular labyrinth is also interacting with the cerebellum directly, and so are the proprioceptors also interacting directly with the cerebellum, more so with the brainstem, of course. And all this information is integrated and finally sent to the cerebral cortex. Now, when does the examination of the patient begin? It begins the moment the patient enters the consultation room, or you enter the emergency room or the ward to see the patient. You have to look for the gait of the patient once the patient has walked into the chamber. Now look at this patient. She is falling and has to be held by the attendants. I told you during the history that a patient of peripheral vestibular disorder usually is able to walk by himself or herself, whereas a patient with a stroke usually, or stroke or any other central disorder, has to be supported. So now this is a patient who turned out to be that of a central disorder. Now when the patient is unable to get out of the bed and you're seeing the patient in the emergency room, just look for truncal ataxia. Ask the patient to sit up in bed and ask the patient to hold his hands over his shoulders like this, and see if he tends to fall to one side or forwards or backwards. Now next we come to the Romberg test. Romberg test or the standing test is a good test, but it gives you information about all the three sensations, that is the visual input, the vestibular input, and also the proprioceptors from your limbs. So the first step in Romberg's is to ask the patient to join his feet together and his hands outstretched with the eyes open. Now here all the three contributors to the balance from the periphery, that is the ear, vestibular labyrinth, the eyes and the proprioceptors are at work. Next you ask the patient to close the eyes, so you eliminated vision. Next you ask the patient to sharpen the Rombergs by, this is called the tandem Rombergs, where the patient puts his one foot in front of the other. Then standing on one leg. Then standing on foam. So by the time you made the patient stand on foam with the eyes closed, you have got rid of two sensations, that is the vision and the proprioception. And in this situation, if the patient tends to fall to one side, you are basically dealing with the vestibular system now. Now this is a further situation where very few people are able to perform this. So I usually normally go up to this level only. Now look at this patient. You're doing a Rombergs in this patient and she has a tendency to fall. Now next we come to the Unterberger or the Fukuda stepping test. All you have to do is to ask the patient to randomly walk while standing at one point. And even this test can be sharpened by asking the patient to walk on foam. Now here is a couple of examples. This is a patient seen on day 2 of an acute attack of vestibular neuritis. And you can say that the patient is swaying to the left, and that is the side involved. There's another patient who tends to sway to the left, but not so badly. And this patient was seen on day 10 of the vestibular neuritis. Now you must also do test for coordination, that is a finger nose test. And this kind of coordination is disrupted in cerebellar disorders. Now the oculomotor examination is the most important when you're dealing with a patient of vertigo. So there are basically 6 types of eye movement systems. One is the fixation or the gaze holding mechanism, where the image of the stationary object is held on the fovea with the head stationary. Then you have the vestibulo-ocular reflex, VOR, which is basically holds the image of the objects on the retina with brief head movements. Optokinetic system holds the image steady on the retina during sustained head movements. This is like, if you're sitting in a train and your head is constantly moving along with the train. And you're looking at the scene outside. This is a system that keeps the images that you are looking at on the outside stable. Saccades. Saccades bring the image of an object of interest quickly onto the fovea. Now supposing I'm talking to one person standing on my left and somebody calls me from the right side. I will suddenly move my eyes to the right. And this is where saccades come into the picture, the saccadic system. Smooth pursuit is, it helps us to hold the image of a small moving target on the fovea. Vergence is when both eyes move in the opposite direction to keep the image of the object on both the foveae. Could be convergence when the eyes move to medially, and it is called divergence when the eyes move laterally towards the. Now you have to look for spontaneous nystagmus. what all things you have to look for when you're looking for spontaneous nystagmus is whether you're dealing with a jerk nystagmus or a pendular nystagmus. Jerk nystagmus is one which has a slow phase in one direction and a fast phase in the other direction. I'll show you examples also. I'll show you videos. But basically, jerk nystagmus has one fast phase and one slow phase. Pendular nystagmus has both slow phases. It has two slow phases. Then next you have to look for the direction of the nystagmus, whether it is beating horizontally, vertically, or it is a mixed horizontal vertical or a mixed or a torsional, purely torsional nystagmus, or is it a periodic alternating nystagmus? Whether the nystagmus is conjugate or not, that is whether it is happening in both the eyes in the same pattern, both the eyes move conjugately during the nystagmus or not, and what is the effect of fixation on the nystagmus. Then there are provocative tests which elicit nystagmus in certain situations, and for this you have to do a Valsalva maneuver, or a pressure induced or a sound induced nystagmus. Then there is head shaking nystagmus. Then there is hyperventilation and positional or positioning nystagmus. We'll come to those slowly. So quickly, the difference between peripheral and central. Peripheral nystagmus is usually a mixed horizontal torsional nystagmus. Here the quick phase beats away from the lesion. The slow phase has a constant velocity, and peripheral nystagmus always increases on removal of fixation. If you make the patient wear Frenzel's glasses or make it totally dark for the patient, the nystagmus is going to increase in intensity. And it follows Alexander's law. What is Alexander's law? The intensity of the nystagmus increases on looking in the direction of the fast phase. So if you have a right beating nystagmus, if the patient is asked to look to his right side, the intensity of the nystagmus will increase. That is Alexander's law. And the other thing, coming to central variety of nystagmus, could be horizontal. So horizontal nystagmus doesn't rule out central causes. Remember that. A pure torsional nystagmus or a purely vertical nystagmus is by the rule always central. It could be a direction changing nystagmus, that is, it could be changing its direction periodically, or on looking in different directions of gaze. Supposing it changes to right beating on right gaze and a left beating on left gaze, that is also called gaze evoked nystagmus. And it is poorly suppressed with fixation. The slow phase may have increasing or decreasing velocity, so it's not constant, and it may increase with gaze away from the direction of the fast phase, so it doesn't follow Alexander's law. And there may be a dissociation between the two eyes, and it is non-adaptable. Now this is an example of a right beating horizontal nystagmus. What the patient is wearing is a modified Frenzel's glasses, that is 16 to 20 diopter convex lenses, and that is the purpose. The purpose of the glasses is removal of fixation. Now again, a VNG picture of the same right beating nystagmus. See, once we have removed the fixation, made it dark for the patient, the intensity of the nystagmus increases. Now, for all practical purposes, any vertical nystagmus, downbeating or upbeating, is always central in origin, and I'll just make it simple. The most important cause for a downbeating nystagmus is a cerebellar lesion, although it may occur with brainstem lesions also. So you can see downbeating nystagmus here. So again, upbeating nystagmus, it is not specific to a particular area, always central, could be due to cerebellar or brainstem lesions. I think I'll skip all this because we don't have much time and these things are probably not so important from the examination point of view. Dr. Pratik?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, should I skip all these?
I think yes, sir. We can.
I think we are running out of time.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So we'll quickly go through a simple and quick clinical examination in a case of acute presentation. You're seeing the patient in the emergency room and he is presented with acute sustained attack of rotatory vertigo. So for that we have the HINTS protocol, or rather the HINTS plus protocol, where we do the head impulse test. We look for the nystagmus. Nystagmus part I've already covered because that was a
Sir, I think we have lost your audio, sir.
the patient at the bedside or sitting in the OPD, and it reflects the viability of the VOR. Now, how to do it? I'm not going into the details. Dr. Srinivas is going to talk about it now. So this is how you do it. You have to hold the head of the patient firmly, and the movements have to be quick, rapid, and the patient should not have a clue as to which side you are going to move the head. And the degree of rotation should not exceed more than 15 to 20 degrees. You can have another look at it because this is important. In a normal patient, the eyes will move in the direction opposite to that of the head movement. If the head moves to the right, the eyes swiftly move to the left. Whereas in a patient with effective VOR, the eyes will make a the eyes move to the right with saccadic intrusions. We can make out the saccadic movement, and as the head moves to the right, the eyes move swiftly to the left. So there are certain pitfalls of the head impulse test. You may get a positive head impulse test in central lesions when there's an infarction in the region where the nerve enters the brainstem. This is called the root entry zone, or in an isolated labyrinthine stroke. Next comes Q deviation. This is done using the cover-uncover test, and what you have to look for is whether one eye in the vertical plane, if one eye is above the other. One eye will be above and the other will be lower. You can make out in this picture here. This is one of my patients. The right eye is lower than the left. And this is part of the ocular tilt reaction. The patient will be tilting his head to the side of the lesion. There will be a counter rolling of the eyes to the side of the vestibular hypofunction and a skew deviation of the eyes, which I told you, one eye is above the other. So in a peripheral disorder, the eye that is on the affected side will be lower and the one that is on the normal side will be higher. Now the thumb rule here is that any lesion occurring from the vestibular labyrinth to the vestibular nerve to the vestibular nuclei and up to the caudal pons, the affliction will be ipsilateral. Whereas anything happening above that in the midbrain area or above is going to cause a contralateral ocular tilt reaction. Another good test to of the otolytic function as well as in acute vestibular neuritis is subjective visual vertical. This is done using the bucket test, and a deviation of more than 2.5 is considered as abnormal, and it's usually on the affected side in peripheral disorders, that is acute unilateral vestibulopathy. One must test for hearing also. If at all you do not do an audiometric examination, but at least a tuning fork examination is a must, and these are the situations where you may find a loss of hearing. Meniere's we already talked about. It may help us in recognizing a transient ischemic attack, and when it comes to central disorders like stroke, an infarction of the anterior inferior cerebellar artery will be accompanied by hearing loss, whereas PICA, posterior inferior cerebellar artery stroke, will not be associated with stroke, with hearing loss. Now, another good test that we do is a high frequency head shake. In this test, what is done is that the head is shaken rapidly from side to side, and 20 such oscillations are made. And if this results in nystagmus at the end of the shaking, you see in the nystagmus here, you could see a brief right beating nystagmus at the end of shaking the head. Now, nystagmus after head shaking is seen in cases of vestibular neuritis. If it's an acute case, the intensity of the nystagmus might increase. And if you're seeing a patient of vestibular neuritis quite a long time after the affliction, you can elicit the nystagmus, which may otherwise have been compensated. Another important disorder in which you get post-head shake nystagmus is acoustic neuroma. Might be seen in Meniere's and BPPV also, but for all practical purposes, vestibular neuritis and acoustic neuroma are the things that you need to remember. Now, the cause for this is an asymmetry in the tone, gain, and timing, and plus it's the velocity storage mechanism that is responsible. This will skip perverted nystagmus. Now I'll briefly go through velocity storage mechanism. Dr. Pratik here told me that I should talk about it during this. So what happens is that if the head is being rotated constantly at a given speed, what will happen is that the hair cells in the cupula are going to get deflected. But they will not continue to remain deflected once the rotation is continued to go on for some time. The hair cells will come back to the resting position, and this is known as the time constant. It takes about 5 seconds during sustained rotation for the hair cells to come back to the resting position, and that leads to a decline in the activity of the vestibular nerve that is supplying the vestibular nuclei. But the vestibular neuronal activity and the compensatory eye movements that are happening because of that, or rather the nystagmus that is happening because of that, that takes much longer. The time constant for that is much more, and that is almost 3 times, around 15 seconds. Because of this velocity storage mechanism, velocity storage mechanism has stored the activity from the hair cells, where in the superior and medial vestibular nuclei in the brainstem. And that is what gives rise to post-rotatory nystagmus. I think I'm going to skip a few slides because time is short now. Now what I am testing for this patient is testing for his smooth pursuit eye movements. I will not discuss in detail what is smooth pursuit because I think during the VNG you're going to hear a lot about it. I'm skipping all this. Yeah, okay, hyperventilation. So what you ask during hyperventilation is you ask the patient to hyperventilate, that is take deep breaths, inhale and exhale rapidly and pretty fast at that for about 40 seconds to 60 or 70 seconds. And the cause for that is what happens during hyperventilation is you are leading to hypocapnia, alkalosis, and that leads to improved conduction in the nerve. That is actually gone. Important aspect which might be asked. If the patient complains of dizziness after hyperventilation and you do not get any nystagmus, this is due to anxiety, and you have to think in terms of situations like phobic postural vertigo. Other, the important causes for hyperventilation-induced nystagmus are microvascular compression, that is vestibular paroxysmia, small acoustic neuromas, or it is also seen in patients of vestibular neuritis if they are seen months after the attack. Pressure sensitivity is required to be tested when you are expecting a third window syndrome, or you have a stapes subluxation, a vestibular fibrosis, or also seen in Arnold-Chiari malformations, and also has cardiovascular causes. So there are two ways to do it. So the Valsalva test that you're supposed to do could be a glottic Valsalva or against a pinched nostril. In glottic Valsalva, you ask the patient to squat against a closed glottis. Well, this is much simpler. Ask the patient to pinch his nostrils and blow his cheeks. Then you have the Henneberg sign or the fistula test, which is done by applying pressure over the tragus. Either it can be done manually or using a you should look for the speech, whether the patient has dysarthria or not, and you should also see if the patient has any swallowing disability, and you are basically trying to check the 9th and 10th nerves. Must check the pulse of the patient, whether it's a regular pulse or an irregular pulse, because cardiac arrhythmia is also one of the causes for dizziness. Facial sensation must be checked. You should look for facial palsy, 7th nerve. Vertebral artery testing is a simple method to look for patients with vertebrobasilar artery insufficiency. Although rare, but it occurs because of impingement of the vessels due to osteophytes or tendinous insertions. And then you should check for all the reflexes also. So the take-home message is you have all the equipment at hand, but it's ultimately your clinical acumen that are going to help you come to a good diagnosis in a patient of vertigo. Thank you very much. Stay safe during the corona period.